Continue our exploration on doubt. We're going to talk about our go-to guy, right? Friends, will you pray with me? Most perfect and holy God, thank you for this crisp fall air, reminding us of the changing seasons in our world and in our lives, oh God. Knowing throughout all of those changes that you walk with us. We give you thanks for your continued presence in our community. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So one good thing that every sermon or every speech or every essay should not do is to give a dictionary definition of a word. Let's just consider poor oratory skills, poor speech writing in general. There's other ways to define words rather than telling you what the dictionary says or telling your listeners what the dictionary says. And for the most part, and I might be a little biased, I think of myself as a pretty good writer from time to time. I am a little biased, I'll admit. A decent public speaker. I would hope you would agree with me. If you don't, So I tend to keep certain writing and public speaking rules in mind. Dictionary definitions definitely being one of those. But today I'm going to break that rule. Because what are rules if they're not to be broken, right? So for some reason I thought it would be a good idea to break that rule this morning. We're going to start by offering a dictionary definition of doubt. So this is what Merriam-Webster has to say. Again, very bad speech writing. You don't want to do this. But I think Merriam-Webster has some good things to offer for us. 3 different definitions that are offered. The first definition of doubt is to call into question the truth of something, as in to not be certain of something. The second definition is to lack confidence in something. And the third is to consider something unlikely. Those are 3 really good definitions of doubt, I think. So keep those in mind as we travel forward this morning. So last week, we talked about the first person in our biblical story to experience these feelings of doubt. The first person who ever had doubts in God's words. And that was Eve. Now, Eve may have been the first, but all of us sitting in this room know that Eve was not the last. Throughout our Bibles, we have accounts of this. Abraham and Sarah, they doubted that they would have a child in their old age, even though God said they would. Moses, he doubted that he could adequately deliver God's message. So God gave him Aaron's voice. When John the Baptist was in prison, he began to doubt that Jesus was the one they had been waiting for. So our Bible is filled with these stories of faithful men and women who had doubts from time to time. But kind of as we talked about last week and we asked people to throw out that first name you think of when we think about doubts in our Bible, we always seem to go to Thomas first. Probably because we have that whole phrase in our language called doubting Thomas. And our good old doubting Thomas, right? He's our go-to guy for our doubts. Now in our story, when we look at this story, a full week, 7 days has passed since Jesus had been crucified. Now, the others who had been there, they told Thomas that Jesus had appeared to him, or to them. And they told Thomas that Jesus is indeed alive. It's all true. And of course, Thomas did not believe them. Thomas doubted. Thomas was uncertain. Thomas lacked confidence in their words. He considered this story unlikely. Now, during 3 short years of ministry, Jesus had roamed the countryside, teaching and preaching the good news, telling thousands upon thousands of people about God's love for them. He performed miracles, healed the sick, He rebuked false teachers. And we even have stories where Jesus raised others from death. And his disciples were witnesses to all of this. They traveled with him and saw it all. They were witnesses to his divine authority. They were witnesses to Jesus' persistent faith. But it only took 1 week for doubt to creep in. After spending 3 years witnessing all of this, it only took 1 week for Thomas to begin to wonder if everything he had been told was true. Because Jesus had told him, right? And yet for us, there's sometimes an expectation that we're not supposed to have any doubt. That we are to have a faith that is stronger than one who actually saw with his own eyes the work that Jesus had done. That to me seems unlikely. Now last week I quoted the Reverend Ray Pritchard, and he says, if you ever arrive at a place where all your doubts are gone and all your questions are answered, then you should relax, because you've arrived in heaven. And I like that, because it acknowledges our humanity. It acknowledges the hills and the valleys, and the words that we recognize might sometimes be uncertain, might consider sometimes the stories of our faith might seem unlikely. I mean, it is unlikely that any of us will be raised from death, right? But every single one of us will be. So it's understandable that our rational minds might question the validity that Jesus Christ was murdered and then raised from death. Because that's not the rational thing. It's the spiritual belief, right? It's understandable that our rational minds might question that this huge, great universe with trillions and trillions of stars and billions of planets, and in all of that, God knows our names individually. It's understandable that our rational minds often want proof. And Thomas wanted to know, that's for sure. And Jesus gave Thomas what he needed in order to relieve his doubts, in order to believe. Jesus did not taunt Thomas. He didn't mock him or make fun of him, nor did Jesus reject him. He simply gave Thomas what he needed to believe. And I believe that Jesus does the same for all of us. Jesus gives us what we need to follow him, gives us what we need to listen to his still speaking voice. And of that, I have no doubt. No pun intended. Or actually, pun intended. So Reverend Pritchard suggests that doubt comes in 3 different forms. And I kind of like his model with a few adaptations. So first, they're intellectual doubts. Now, these are the doubts where our rational mind comes into play. Doubts where that God-given capacity for reason wants hard and fast proof, right? Things like, was Jesus really born of a virgin? Did Moses really part the Red Sea? Is the story of Noah and the ark an allegory, or did it really happen? These are the questions that we ask that lead us to intellectual doubts. Now, the second category is spiritual doubt. This is a whole different kind of things, because these tend to be a little more personal. These are the doubts that we can creep in when we have doubt in our relationship and with our God. Things like, am I a good Christian? Why did I lie when I know it was wrong? If I don't fully believe in everything, am I going to hell? Those are the existential questions, the personal questions that kind of lie in that category of spiritual doubt. Now, the third and final category, this is a category we're going to call situational doubts, circumstantial doubts. And this is where most of our doubts in our faith live. This is where we struggle probably more often than others. Because these are the hard questions that meet at the crossroads of our faith and our lived experience in life. What we believe and what we actually see happening. And these are the really, really hard questions. Things like, why did my husband die? Why would God allow refugee families to be separated? Where was God when I was abused? Where was God during the Holocaust? Those are the really hard questions that we ask. That sometimes we think that even voicing concerns like this might lead us down a path that we do not want to go. That if we give these situational doubts any power, that we might be completely overwhelmed and completely ruin any chance that we have at relationship with God. But I believe the opposite to be true. These really hard questions are the ones that we need to explore. These really hard questions are the ones that we need to seek the answers. I don't know that we will ever have a satisfactory explanation to explain why bad things happen in this world, to explain why evil is present among us. But I do know that if we do not ask ourselves these hard questions, both privately and in community, that we deny ourselves a chance to grow. Questioning our faith is not a bad thing. Ignoring our questions, that is a bad thing. Because our God is big enough. Our God is strong enough. Our God is wise enough to handle our difficult questions. The question for us, are we wise enough to ask those questions? It is the exploration that is the journey of faith. Asking the questions is a declaration of our faith, not a denial of it. Even as uneasy as it might make us feel at times to question God, I believe this is a sign of our deep and maturing and growing faith in God. Because there's a vast difference between saying something like, God, why did you not stop the terrorists on 9/11? And saying, well, why bother asking? God's not going to listen. That's hugely different. Because when we don't ask those really hard questions, we are led to a place of complacency. And in the land of complacency, there can be little growth. Now, I want to look back at our gospel story for a second to see how this turns out for Thomas, right, who we're looking at today. Thomas says, unless I see Jesus, unless I touch him, I will not believe that he is risen. So Jesus gives him what he needs in order to believe. Not to doubt, but to believe. And then Thomas makes a declaration that is completely unique to him. Completely unique to anyone else in Christian Scripture. Thomas cries out, my Lord and my God. Thomas is the only person in our Bibles to call Jesus God. Let that sink in for a minute. Thomas is the only person in our Bibles to call Jesus God. It is through his doubts that his faith is affirmed. It is through his doubts that his faith grows and that he learns to believe. And it is through our doubts that our faith grows and that we learn to believe even more as well. Now, does that mean I believe that Jesus will appear to each one of us, that our faith might be affirmed in the same way as Thomas? Well, I think that's unlikely. Which, if you remember, was one of our definitions for doubt. But I don't rule that out. But what God has given us, I believe, is just as powerful as what God gave, or as what Christ gave Thomas. Because God has given us this story. God has given us this witness. And God has given us God's love for all of us to walk through the valleys of our doubt with us. And God has given us each other, my friends. And what a beautiful gift is that. So will any of us have doubts in the future? Well, of that I have no doubt. But I also have no doubt that each and every time that we enter a season, enter a valley of doubt, that God will walk along with us, that God will lead us to the other side of that valley, leading us to a stronger and more mature faith, a deeper faith. And we know the mightiest of oak trees that stands among us goes dormant in the winter, right? Leaves fall off and it stops growing. But in the spring, it awakens and blooms again and begins new life. And we are just like that. We are the same. Throughout our lives, we're going to weather various seasons, weather the ebbs and flows of doubt and faith. But I believe that in the end, each and every one of us will be affirmed in God's abiding love for us. A love that has no season and a love that never doubts us. May it be so, my friends.